Okay, are we all seeing my screen and share mode? Is it in presentation mode? Oops. Here we go. All right, so welcome everyone. Greetings. We're so glad to have so many people here this evening for this skills clinic. So I wanted to just start by introducing myself. I am Megan Mahalik. I'm a middle school teacher in Los Angeles, California. And I have been using the OER project, specifically Big History Project with my sixth graders for the past 3 years. And before that was a fourth and fifth grade teacher doing a lot of English language arts. So these skills clinics and the idea of writing and reading comprehension, I find to be hugely important for my social studies students. So this session is meant to be collaborative today. And a session for all of us to share our ideas and to collaborate and learn together. So we'll be thinking about our classroom practices and kind of challenging ourselves to think about how we can incorporate comparison into our classrooms. So although OER project has a lot of great materials to use for social studies, specifically for comparison, tonight we're really focusing on this skill and how we can use it in our classrooms. So for me, what I like most about this idea of comparison are all the tools that we're going to share with you this evening can actually be applied across subject areas and used in a multitude of ways. So I encourage you to really think about how you can be using them in your classrooms. All right, so just quickly, our agenda for this evening. I'm going to go over everything. Our icebreaker, you've mentioned in the chat where you're coming from and what you teach. So welcome to all of you. We are going to talk about OER's approach to comparison, so where this came from and how we've sort of established these different tools. We will also share some student examples and allow you to review those in smaller breakout rooms. We've got some middle school examples as well as high school examples for you to take a look at. We'll come back together as a group and sort of discuss some of your observations based on the tools that we've shared with you. We'll then give you a chance to actually get together again in breakout rooms and think about interventions. So the ways that you would use your skills to coach students, to either coach them up, to meet them where they are, and to sort of scaffold their growth as comparison makers. From there, we're going to share some tips for success that we've learned over our time and put together in part from teacher participation during these skills clinics. And then we will share some resources and supports that are available to you through the OER project that you can come back to even after this session is over. And we'll wrap everything up with a survey that's very short that we'll ask you all to complete just because that feedback is very helpful. So our objectives today, teach you about the OER approach to comparison, and we'll share some tools with you, like I mentioned. Share these interventions and ideas that we have. Like I said, this collaborative environment that we've got this evening will be really helpful for us to share our ideas and hopefully leave this session feeling like it was time well spent and that we have tools we can implement right away in our own classrooms. Okay. And like I said, we'll implement hopefully these tools into our classrooms. Before I go on, I also wanted to introduce our chat moderator this evening, and that's Anne Koshminder. Would you like to briefly say anything or introduce yourself, Anne?
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Ann Kushmader from Northern Michigan. I use OER project materials for my AP World History students, juniors and seniors, and also on-level sophomores, mostly from the 1200 and 1750 course. I've been working with OER project for about 4 years in my classroom and have seen a lot of growth in student skill development. So excited for tonight. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm so glad to have Anne here. It's nice to have that we have the middle school and high school perspectives to share with all of you. All right, so quickly, I'm just going to go over our norms for these. Just, we're in Zoom and doing professional development, but I would prefer that it not be quiet. In fact, I totally encourage you during this to unmute, share ideas that you have. I think more voices and more conversation are better. It will get our ideas flowing. And if you're thinking that you have a question, I bet someone else has it too. So I say the more voices, the merrier. So feel free to either use that raise hand feature or go ahead and unmute yourself. I encourage you to ask questions. If you have resources or anecdotes that you'd like to share, feel free to drop those in the chat or clarifying questions, and Anne will be sure that we address those with all of you. If you have your camera on, that would be great. It feels more like we're together, even though we're apart, just with our faces all together. Not mandatory, preferred. Collaboration is great and key to our success. So definitely building off the ideas you hear today is excellent. Obviously, your personal needs come first. I recognize we're all in some different time zones today. So whatever works for you in order to get the most out of this session, let's do that because this is your time. And we are so grateful that you're choosing to spend some of it with us. All right, so let's jump in. All right, so OER's approach to comparison. So I know for me personally, there's so many professional development options, so many ways that we can approach every subject area. So for me, the number one question is always, what's the rationale behind this curriculum or these ideas? And for comparison, the answer is the College Board. So OER has worked with the College Board not worked with, but is using the College Board as their guide to structure what students need to do to be successful with this skill of comparison, specifically thinking about the AP exam. So reviewing exams after they've been released and also discussing teaching methods with other veteran AP teachers and College Board faculty members allowed OER Project to develop these different tools and this approach to comparison. All right, so I'm not going to read you this definition. It's there for you if you'd like to. But what I think is the most important thing when we're thinking about comparison is this idea that comparison is more than just surface level, what's similar and what's different, right? And I think this is the crux of what we need to teach our students is not only do you look for something that's similar and different when you're comparing events, but you also want to think about, are those comparisons actually relevant? Do they matter? And we also want to think about, are they significant through the lens of history that we're studying, right? In the case of social studies and history. So with all that being said, prepare yourselves. Drum roll, please. I'm about to blow your mind with this next comparison tool. Here we go. Ta-da! It's a Venn diagram. Now, I'm sure this is not anything that is new to most of you. You've probably seen Venn diagrams before. In fact, you've probably used them before. They're easy to draw, great note-taking tool, and an easy strategy to share with students, right? Usually the circle when students are younger and becoming a little more complex. Now, the thing with this comparison tool is that it is slightly different and takes a slightly different take on your typical Venn diagram. It doesn't ask students to look at general unique similarities and differences. It asks them to think more specifically through the lens of categories, right? So we're considering time, place, community, production and distribution centers, and other networks, right? The thing that I like about this is for higher level writing and comparison making, it's allowing students to map out and see, what do I have that seems like a relevant comparison and different in these categories? And it allows them to find holes or search for the strongest argument when they then take this tool and this planning device and then go into their actual writing. So it kind of allows them to see how their argument or their writing might take shape. All right, so why study comparison, or why use it in the first place, right? So we have a couple bullet points here from Trevor Getz, an African history professor from San Francisco State University. And he has done some research and has this to say about comparison. It helps us to develop structures around our knowledge. It helps us to build our sourcing skills, right? So that's going back to this what's the historical significance of making these comparisons? It helps students to look at two separate events and then think about how they may have turned out differently from each other, and then understand the broader context or contextualization. Comparison is also a great jumping off point, right, to build other literacy skills. And if we're thinking about things like debate or historical argumentation, it's a building block in our classroom. And we chose to sort of end around first trimester time for the skills clinic with this skill, because it does feel like students have had enough time to settle into the year, get routines in place, start to dive deeply into the content, and now they're going to do something productive with that content. So the question is, how do we know that our students actually understand how to compare effectively, right? That's why we're here. So they can pick out things that are similar and different, but we want to be sure that they're ready to cognitively jump up and think more about the complexity of the historical issues and comparisons. Okay, so here is our first tool that is being dropped in. So this is what we call our comparison checklist. In all of our classrooms, we think about skills, right? So how are students progressing through? Where are there gaps? Where do we need to coach them up, or where are things kind of missing? So since we work with comparison throughout the school year, this can be a really helpful tool to use. I know for me personally, one of the things I like best when looking at this comparison checklist is the fact that you can kind of parse it out, and there's different categories with each of those gray headings. And I don't think that for every comparison assignment, you need to necessarily use this whole thing, but different pieces of it can be used effectively throughout the year. And it's also a really great tool for tracking growth and change over time with your students. You can also think about, for a specific assignment, what's the goal or the purpose, right? So if we're thinking about maybe some pre-writing right at the start, that first category, description of similarities or differences, and thinking about, do they consider an event? Are they considering historical development, regions or eras or other areas, right? So like, how many things can my student actually brainstorm that's similar or different? Or we could be thinking about maybe later in the year, if they're turning it into a writing piece, the level of their analysis, right? Or the explanation of the significance, right? So talking more and saying more, elaborating on their thinking. This checklist is I think it's a really excellent tool, and I've already started using it in my classroom this year, just more for the pre-writing aspect. I'm going to give you a minute or two here. Go ahead and review this, and I'd love to hear from anyone if they have any thoughts or ideas of how they might utilize this in their classroom. And feel free to jump in if you have ideas or any categories that are jumping out at you.
I want to interrupt, but if I can just remind everybody that the links that Megan is referring to are in that link that I put in the chat earlier, and we'll repeat again just to make sure everybody has it. It's from Dropbox, and you can just kind of follow along sequentially to make sure everything is captured easily for you.
And so you can utilize it after the fact, right? So you're leaving with tools that will be useful once we really break them down and analyze them today. Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm imagining most of you have this tab actually pulled up so that it's available to you to continue viewing as we move forward. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to take some time to look at this checklist and compare it against some student exemplars. This is a really great way, right, to decide, is this tool useful for me, or how will I actually utilize it, by looking at some student work. So we've got middle school and high school examples here. And so I think what we're going to encourage you to do once we jump out to different breakout rooms is to really think about which of those feels more appropriate for you, which lens, and then you can select the breakout room for middle school or high schools. There will be several to choose from. Okay, so our first sample, this is our high school one, and I know the text is a bit small, so I'll sort of preview and let you know what the content is all about. This focuses on World History Project, and the World Tour of Women's Suffrage is the activity that is being used for this activity. So the goal of this is to have students take a world tour to look at how women's suffrage has traveled around the world. So to think about how different locations and places have had a different journey to women's suffrage. So they are looking at 6 different regions of the world in this case. So we've got Australia and New Zealand, Europe, Asia, North America, Latin America, and Africa. Once they go through all of the documents that are provided, they are supposed to create a timeline. They'll read through the articles and then complete this comparison tool. So at the end, they'll have a picture of these 6 different regions, and they'll be able to see very specifically the similarities and differences between them and the journey to a woman's right to vote. So many of you, I'm hoping, have done similar activities where you've got a variety of stories or cultures or events, and you're asking students to compare and contrast them. So I think this concept is probably pretty on target for most of us. And I'm going to also share the middle school example too, just so that you have the context necessary when you jump into the breakout room. All right. This one is not a typical comparison activity. In the sense that it asks students to read an article, and they're doing it through the lens of 3 close reads, which in a nutshell, for those of you not familiar with this strategy, consists of sort of doing a skim and going through an article, looking for the gist, reading it word by word for information, and then going over it again to be sure that you understand the main points and can start thinking about how it ties into previous concepts and making connections to other ideas. So for this one, and my students have actually done this origin story work already this year, there are origins or creation myths from several different cultures and places around the world, and students can read them and compare them. In this particular activity, they would read one, and then they're going to look at the work from other students around the classroom in order to add notes to their document. So it's not typical in that it's a collaborative comparison activity. So they will add information to their document based on the expert groups from around their classroom. So the main question they need to answer, you'll see is down here. Are there any significant similarities or differences among the stories that leap out at you? So they're really looking to pull differences based on what they're hearing from other students' work. How do we feel about this as a middle school prompt? Maybe some thumbs up or thumbs down from those of you who are in the middle school world. Okay. So those are our 2 prompts. And here's what you're going to do now. Good. I'm seeing some thumbs up. I love it. We've got some middle school teachers in the mix. All right. So when you go to the breakout room, here are your steps. You are going to be looking at either the middle school or high school example, and you're going to be looking at it through the lens of the comparison tool. So you're going to look through those categories that we sort of gave you on that comparison tool checklist and think about what feedback, advice, or next steps you would give this particular student. Okay, and what we would like to do is designate a speaker. It's too quiet for me right now. So when you come back from your breakout room, the person who had the most ounces of coffee today in your breakout room will be the person to share out for your group with hopefully some brilliant ideas and observations that you have noticed. Would anyone like to repeat the directions back to me? This is always the moment at which I panic. I go to a breakout room and I don't remember the directions. So maybe someone can verbally tell us, what are we going to do? Anyone?
Review the example assigned to our breakout room, and then the person who drank the most coffee when we come back is going to summarize what we talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashley. I appreciate it. Yes. So think about what next steps or feedback you would give that student. Fabulous. And in that document that Anne dropped into the chat, that's where you'll find that collaborative Google document. And so actually you'll get a little insight. You'll be able to see some of the things the other groups are coming up with, which if you're struggling, that might spark some inspiration. So
just logistically here for the breakout rooms, we have 6 created. They're going to be self-select based upon your primary level of instruction, high school or middle school. Breakout rooms numbers 1, 2, and 3 will be for high school teachers. 4, 5, and 6 will be for middle school teachers. The Google Doc that Megan referenced is included in that master links sheet tonight. And there are note-taking columns specific to every breakout room toward the bottom of the sheet. Megan, are we ready to open the rooms?
I think we are.
Excellent.
And I'll go ahead and pause my share for this. Oh, Ashley, that's funny. Man,
I'm
if
like
I
that kid that asked to go to the bathroom to get out of doing something and I didn't mean to. I just hit the wrong button.
if we had $1 for every time someone clicked sign out of Zoom instead of leave breakout room, right? Hopefully they'll allow you back next time, right?
Yeah, I think I might have inadvertently just been voluntold to share what we talked about.
Oh, I love that. Wow, our first volunteer. So it sounds like in some of the rooms, some of you in true excellent educator form decided to go ahead and fully preview the assignment before jumping into the student exemplar. No problem if that's the case, because you're going to have a chance to actually get back together in breakout rooms and talk more about intervention and strategies for sort of raising the level of the comparison and writing work for each of the students. So you'll have a chance to take another look at them and take a deeper dive. But I would love to hear just in general, because we did have one group looking at middle school and 2 looking at high school, just some of your general observations about what you may have encouraged that learner to do based on what you saw in their work. Would anyone like to share anything that they heard? Anyone who drank a lot of coffee today?
Well, I'll volunteer to be tribute.
Love it.
So I was in the middle school room. It took us a while to figure out what we were supposed to be looking at with that whole drop-down list. That whole that chart that you gave us from the Dropbox thing. I got to tell you, and don't take this the wrong way, but it's like every one of these, I've been in all 3 things in this series, and it's not real clear all the time what we're supposed to be opening and looking at.
Okay.
As a group. So that would be one thing I would kind of maybe specify, hey, if you're, because like we had supposedly had 6 breakout rooms, but we only had 4 things, and it was 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And so it was a little confusing. But once we figured it out, we looked at the low, and the low first, of course, didn't take really a whole lot of effort to analyze, because it looks like something that, I don't know, probably at least a third of my students like to do is just write a word or, and then copy the same word over and over again. So obviously that needed a whole lot of work. But the ones that we looked at that, and I'm assuming since some of the boxes, and this was one of the things that we were trying to figure out as a group, since some of the boxes had a lot of detail and then others didn't have as much detail, we figured those were the different stories, and each different group had filled those things out. So one of the things we were talking about is in the kids looking at each other's assessments of the origin stories, one of the things that we thought maybe would be a good one, for example, we were talking about how with the chart section here for Greek, how where it says down at the bottom that gods ruled for the relationship between humans and plants and animals, we were talking about how that didn't seem to go into as much detail as some of the other groups with the same question for their different stories. And one of the ladies in our group suggested that that would be a great opportunity to have the different groups of kids sitting together for the ones that they looked at, and then have like a Q&A kind of session, almost like a Socratic thing, where it's like, okay, I read this, but because like we said, maybe the God's rule is clear to that group or that kid, whoever filled that out, but it's not going to be clear to everybody else what they're talking about in comparison to that relationship. So that was something that we kind of came up with for that.
I think that's a great point. And I feel like that hits at this idea that context is so important, right? And making sure that your information is clear for an unfamiliar reader. I'll give you a suggestion if you plan or if anyone uses this. One thing that I've done that's been really effective, because I have done something similar where my students actually present out on these origin stories, and then the students take the notes. Before they do that, I actually have them come up with their own summary once they read their article. So they're pulling the most important points, sharing a very brief summary, and then kind of sharing out how they would categorize that information. So kind of like an expert group jigsaw. But I think that's a really good point. Just kind of copying the notes, you might need a little bit more to actually understand what does that note that I took mean. So great point. Either of our high school groups, I'd love to hear. I know someone had unmuted earlier. I don't know if they wanted to share. Oh, thanks, Adam. Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So we were looking at the third, the link that was in breakout room 3, which was in red, and it was actually it was really well done. It seemed to us, it had a lot of specific details through and through. So the big pieces of feedback that we kind of came out with were sort of like, how do we make sure that this writing in the comparison tool is meaningful? Is sort of students have a tendency to look at the articles or the resources and kind of throw up onto the page and make it try to appear as full as possible. So how do we make sure that the comparison is authentic? A student is sort of doing that historical thinking in terms of the comparison. And Dan brought up this question, and then with the place where we saw really good work also was in the similarities and differences and in the thesis statement. So the question that Dan came up with, I thought was very good as well, which was, I think it's in the note taker here. Just want to see if I can accurately summarize it. That in the tool, the connection to the current day. So there's a question about like, how do these struggles of women relate to struggles of women today, and to what extent is that would seem to be the weakest part, or the part where the students struggle the most. So how do we make that question, not just sort of like platitudes, right? Or the responses like, yeah, women are still struggling for their rights today or something like that, and make it more part of their part of their thinking and part of their comparison. And we were sort of talking about whether this is a question that kind of weaves through the entire curriculum, and maybe that's where that student should be working towards that type of thinking, or whether that it should be in the feedback was more for us, right? Whether it's like we should phrase that question differently, but just sort of how to make that connection to today more robust or more meaningful for the students.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So, getting a little bit like you're already thinking about interventions, it sounds like, and maybe the idea of an essential question that's driving each of your units or like each piece of writing that they circle back to. So that level of like familiarity, really like bolstering their writing over the long term and their thinking. Yeah, great thought. Does anyone else want to share a thought they had before we jump into actually thinking about interventions and how we can raise the level of this comparison work? Just making sure. Okay. All right. Let me go ahead and share my slides with you again then. Oops. Of course, I'm all the way at the beginning. Apologies about that. Okay, here we go. So these were just screenshots of what you potentially saw depending on the room you're in. So Adam, that was actually a beautiful transition. I could not have orchestrated that better, because the next thing that we really want to think about, and this is where I think the beauty of this collaborative environment is really helpful, is thinking about what do we do when we have students who really struggle to do this work of making relevant comparisons and tying historical significance into them. So thinking about also, in addition, students who are struggling, but we also want to think about our students who are really meeting expectations and how we can continue to raise their level of work as well. So kind of thinking on both ends of that spectrum. So pushing and bringing up and raising the level of the writing for students who are struggling. So we were going to be thinking about supports, adjustments, and interventions. So for our next breakout room, what we want you to think about is that checklist and how you can actually use that checklist tool that we showed you in the beginning. So it should be one of the very first things on that drop-down list of sources that Anne had dropped in the beginning. We want you to review the comparison assignment, and we want you to really think about how you could intervene to get students to engage with this activity. So maybe how are you going to fill holes? How are basically thinking about like the art of teaching here. So what is it that you can do to support your students to raise that level of writing, thinking about all those different categories that are on that checklist. So this will be a bit more of an in-depth discussion, especially for those of you who had a chance to preview the assignment as opposed to more of the work in depth, and think about how can you move a student towards more proficiency with that checklist? Would you establish more routines? Are there certain structures that you could use, instructional moves? And the thing is, we all know that we have those students that we always have to plan for, right? There's always going to be a student where we need to tweak something slightly or introduce something in a different way or do that one-on-one check-in when it's time to get to work. So these are the things we want to think about because typically the strategies that will help that one student tend to help quite a few students in the classroom. So we'd love to have you share out your ideas, record them on the same Google Doc. And let's see, for this, who will I ask to share out? The person who has been teaching the longest in your breakout room. And I'll leave that up to interpretation. It could be the most minutes of teaching today or the most years overall. I'll leave it up to you and your group. So that'll be a fun little discussion to have. So again, we're thinking about interventions, supports, and how we can push our student to move towards proficiency based on that comparison checklist. And we'll give you about 15 minutes to do this. And we'll reopen the breakout rooms and you'll be able to select the same room as before. Is that correct, Anne?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, most excellent. So are there any questions before we send you? I am really impressed with the robust list of suggestions that I see on the Google Doc. So I'm excited to have some of the groups share out and explain maybe some of their rationale or maybe make a connection to the idea through the lens of the actual assignment. So how you would raise that level of work or how you might implement some of those ideas. So hello, welcome back. Okay, let's see. I think we're all back. All right, so veteran teachers or veteran teachers for minutes taught today. Does anyone want to share out or be tribute for their group? There's amazing suggestions on here, so we should be excited to share out. Oh, thanks, Tony. Awesome.
So we are in the middle school group, we were looking at this chart of the origin stories, and especially the one student had a lot of like one-word answers for a variety of the sections of the origin stories. Like some of the things we were thinking about was trying to create like some sentence frames to try to guide their reading and what they should write into the different sections of their origin story to avoid these one-word answers that aren't very descriptive at all. Another thing we talked about was, maybe trying to tier the assignment at the end and take, maybe your higher students and have them have a more robust discussion leading to some of those areas of the checklist, like relevancy, versus maybe your students who are struggling, they get additional support time, and maybe you're just gearing their conversations of comparisons towards more basic or on the surface comparisons at first. And then somebody suggested kind of like this bucket type of a system where when you're looking at the text, try to think about, putting your information into buckets, stuff that is helping you answer what you're trying to do, like something that you would agree with, maybe a side that's something that you disagree with, or something that's factual but doesn't really fit into anything that you're trying to put into your chart. I think sometimes when students are going through these, especially this assignment, the origin stories, it's highly abstract. It's kind of, some of these stories are kind of kooky. So it's a matter of trying to mine the text and figure out what am I going to find that's going to fill out my chart, and what's just interesting details, but they're not really helping me either way in filling out the chart. So that's what we were kind of talking about as a way to kind of help all the different learners, depending, no matter if you're high or low on, in completing the chart.
Awesome. I love that idea of like sentence frames. And I think you have a good point of the relevancy question, right? Like, is that a detail that actually matters? Is that going to be a helpful comparison to use? And I also think it's great, the idea of, I know a lot of students really, they relish the opportunity to kind of have like a leadership role or look like, hey, I've got a great idea and I'm going to kind of lead off our discussion by adding in something amazing. So yeah, that's a good point to talk
And the
about.
other thing, just real quick, the other thing I forgot to mention was maybe having them cite some of the text directly into the chart, as a way to kind of guide them and to make sure that they're thinking about the proper category in the chart.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I know for some of my lower students, they do have a tendency to quote a lot and put direct quotes in. And then if they got the quote in there, the next step is, why don't you paraphrase it down below, right? But then at least you're seeing where they're pulling it from the text to see if it's good stuff. Yeah, so that's an excellent idea. Love it. Great stuff. Does anyone else want to share out some of their thoughts? Maybe some high school?
I'll talk about the high school stuff.
Great.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ashley. Ashley.
So we kind of looked at the checklist as like a tool of how we can help them. So we brought up that like the reason and analysis, like level 1, 2, 3 might be a good way to get them to think about like, well, where do you think you are on this? And we also, as opposed to middle school where you might want them to put directly from the text into all of the boxes, we tend to emphasize a little bit more that we need to try to move away from that and paraphrase it the first time and not just copy and paste. So we talked about like maybe trying to help emphasize that in their analysis rather than just copying and pasting the stuff. And then on those like examples of historical significance things, we mentioned that like over the course of the different comparison assignments, we might kind of model each of the different categories to help give them an idea. And we did also talk about, particularly with thesis statement, like how you might frame that, because several of us teach freshmen who are still struggling to put a thesis into like an actual thesis, and not just a word vomit sentence.
Good point. Yeah, I think that's great. I also think, remember that idea that this checklist, you don't have to use the whole thing all the time, right? And I do think there is, value for the kids in seeing that maybe when you're having a one-on-one conference with them, or maybe it's you just insert one aspect of that checklist at the end of their writing so that they get to look over it. Maybe they self-score themselves. And then when you're conferring with them, it's sort of like, oh, I see that you thought this was proficient. Can you tell me why? Or where do you think you can push yourself here too? Because I think that's important too, that metacognition with our students, right? Is where they are, where they actually think they are. And so that's where I think those tools like these rubrics and checklists can be super helpful for our students.
We also mentioned a couple of things with like differentiating higher learners and lower learners, because like we were talking about like people who are on the kind of lower end on like the blue example for us, that maybe it would have helped them to have fewer things to compare. Whereas maybe the others should have, if you did all these three really easily, maybe you should add a fourth and make it a little bit more difficult for them, or give them an extra challenge if they were up for it.
Yes, it's not more work, it's a challenge. Semantics are important, right? Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Did anyone else want to share from the final group? Or do you feel like everyone's stolen your thunder? Potentially. Okay. Well, then I
don't think we really had much else other than what the other high school group said. I mean, we just we did agree that we focused on the blue example because we thought the other group was focusing on the red, and we're like, well, that they need a lot of assistance. So definitely sufficient detail was lacking. So we think that trying to break it down for them and maybe have them focus on a comparison of fewer regions would be really helpful. and how to kind of parse out the details to substantiate the broad stroke arguments that they were making would be really helpful, because there was a lot of detail lacking there.
Excellent. And I will say just the thoughts popping into my head, because I'm going to transition into some helpful tips that we have for you as well, as we're nearing sort of our end of time here. During another one of these sessions, someone had brought up how when thinking about historical significance, it can feel tough if the context is so unfamiliar to some of your students. So she talked a lot about trying to find similar current events or a current connection that has some level of, familiarity and similarity for the students to kind of help them understand this like historical significance piece. So, history doesn't have to be 100 years ago. History could be something that happened last week too, right? So just kind of helping students, especially pushing them along with that significance piece. So, well, thank you everyone for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and, speaking of sharing, share my screen now with a few tips that we have. So these are probably not anything that's going to come as a surprise to you, because you've probably, you're probably using some of these, but these are sort of our tried and true. Oh, I don't know why it keeps doing that. I'm so sorry. Click, click, click. All right, here we go. Oh no. Wow. End of the school day for me. Here we go. Okay. We've done that. Here we go. Tips for success. All right. So this is actually great because this first one comes straight from Anne. So this concept of always having a clash when you have a comparison. Anne, can I put you on the spot since you're here? Do you want to kind of elaborate on that and what it means? Because it's a big contribution that you made.
Thank you. I did a brief stint as a debate coach, and clash was a term that we use, especially with our novices, to ensure that you're directly answering your opponent's arguments. It just has some vivid imagery that I feel like helps students to understand what a good quality comparison is too. Otherwise, my kids sometimes have a tendency to list stuff about topic A and list stuff about topic B, but I want them to really come head to head in a direct comparison.
Awesome. I think that is such a great visual. And I think it resonates with students too, right? Because it's this idea of in an argument, or when you're trying to convince someone of a similarity or difference, or to agree with your side of the story, it better be relevant and make sense. And it needs to follow the previous examples you've included. So also thinking about having a clear focus question when students are comparing, whatever it is that they're comparing, right? Making sure that it's clear that this is what we're focused on. I'm sure we've all experienced that. I've had many assignments this year where I go, wow, I could have worded that question more clearly. So this idea of clarity, right? Also thinking about what is it that we are doing with the comparison. So thinking about, are we having a discussion about what's similar and different? Is the final outcome going to be a piece of writing? Are we connecting to something that we've done previously? So doing something meaningful with it and taking it beyond, just that Venn diagram. Although there is value in just doing a brainstorm, but just thinking about what's the overall goal when we're doing this comparison. Also trying to find balances between similarities and differences. These they don't always have to be equal, right? It's not like you have to brainstorm and have 5 things that are the same and 5 things that are different, right? Sometimes there's a little bit of an actual imbalance. And so we need to help students. This kind of goes back to this clash idea of finding what it is that is a meaningful way to compare two things. And it might be using a different amount of arguments or a different amount of evidence pieces. And then of course, model. And some people also, I saw said that on the Google Doc in their brainstorm, right? So the I do, we do, you do. So that kind of strategy, the more of that, the better. Or even calling on other students. I also find for modeling, sharing student examples when they're doing a really great job, even if it's just getting started, that take a pause and say, hey, everyone, I noticed that so-and-so has done this thing. And do you mind if I use you as an example? And kind of sharing out the thing that they wrote as sort of a source of inspiration particularly when students are getting started with what challenging work rather. All right, so, oh, Larson, yes.
So one of the things that I did after the free close read one was, even though it wasn't the course I teach, and in fact, because it wasn't the course I teach, I showed them the exemplars that I got from here as a way to go, hey, this is a good exemplar, this one needs some work, and basically made them take notes on it of, hey, how does this improve? And basically what we did, because then you have exemplars that are coming from somewhere else. And I said to them, the positive, the best, the good exemplar is what I expect you to be at the end of the year. I made very clear to them, I don't expect you to have that tomorrow. So I think that's a great use of the materials you get from this. And it, I think, has worked well because my 3 close reads are much better this year than they were last year.
That's awesome. Hey, we'll take it.
The other thing I learned out of that meeting was people talked about stamina and students not having the stamina we would expect. So I cut back the 3 close reads to, okay, we're going to do this section that we're going to do the second and third read on to try and not overwhelm them as much. So I don't know which one of those has done the trick, but something has.
Awesome. It's the combination, the symbiosis of all three, maybe. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So next steps to keep this conversation going, if you're interested, and we hope that you are. So you're taking away, obviously, some great visuals that you can, of course, tweak and modify to make work in your own classroom. But we also have a really robust online community at OER Project. And there are so many teachers that teach all of the different OER project courses who are posting examples of student work, responding to questions, initiating conversations about whatever current unit they're in, or asking for how someone has made an assignment go well. And this is a really great place to get started, just because there are so many teachers on here. And I think the best thing is people are willing to be vulnerable and ask for help and support on here. And there's some really great conversations that have been generated. So I believe all of you were able to you should be able to just go ahead and click and log into the community based on the fact that you registered today. So check it out. And specifically, we do post what we call after party threads after all of these skills clinics, where we have a conversation started about the topic comparison that we've been discussing. So feel free to drop in some ideas there or respond to some of the conversations happening there and connect with other teachers who are doing this comparison work right along with you. And if you liked anything you heard today, which hopefully you did, or hopefully you're feeling inspired and have some ideas for new ways to approach comparison, there's more. So we do offer a lot of different professional development options related to the specific courses that OER offers, but also related to specific skills similar to how we did comparison today. So keep your eyes peeled for those. There are great opportunities to learn more and to connect with fellow teachers. So finally, we are at the end. I think we did pretty well on time. So we've got a couple minutes left. We would absolutely love it if you complete this exit survey. You could also scan the QR code to get it to work. It's very short, couple questions, but any feedback you have for us to help these run more smoothly or to get you more of the information that you want, we are very open to that. We've also got the events at OER Project email down there if you have any questions, and that's about it. My email is at the beginning. I can go back to that first screen or drop it in the chat if anyone has follow-up questions for me. But other than that, thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate the conversation and the ideas that you all shared. Hopefully you are departing inspired and feeling like that was a worthwhile way to spend your afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. So thank you.